Welcome, everybody. Big thanks for joining us today. So we'll just give it a minute or two just for a few more people to join, and then we'll get going. Welcome all. Right, Paul, over to you, sir.
Okay, yeah, we'll kick off, shall we? So yeah, good afternoon and welcome. My name's Paul Noakes. I'm the Managing Director of Projecting Success. Today we're hosting this webinar to launch the third instalment of the Next Generation series of books. This third book is called Next Gen Project Assurance, and I'll be introducing you to the three co-authors. Just before we start, I'd like to make sure that if you have any questions through the webinar, to add them to the question to the chat box or into the question box. And also we like to make this as interactive as possible. So as we go through, there'll be a Mentimeter come up. So please make sure you participate and answer that as well. Okay, so today we've got the pleasure of hosting the three authors, Michael Steinberg, Andy Murray, and Martin Paver. So Michael has a background of portfolio management, starting in the Infrastructures and Project Authority, organising the government major projects portfolio. Later, he helped to manage the rail portfolio until it changed during COVID. Then he helped to set up the Rail Infrastructure Portfolio Office. He set up the MOD's Enterprise Portfolio Management Office as well for Defence Nuclear, and that's bringing together a holistic view for DNE. Andy Murray is the Executive Director of Major Project Association and a non-executive director and advisor to project organisations. Excuse me. Prior to his current role, he spent 35 years as a practitioner, consultant, author, and assurer of complex projects and programmes for public, private, and third sector organisations, both domestically and internationally. And then thirdly, Martin Paver is the founder and chairman of Projecting Success. And that's a business that's been at the forefront of data and AI for project transformations for well over 10 years. Martin also has a background in major project delivery, including working for NATO, leading the Typhoon flight simulator project, leading a major nuclear mega project, and also a $10 billion PMO. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining. Martin, can I start with you? Can you tell us a bit more about yourself and then help to set the scene of the book? So how did it all come about?
So thanks a lot, Paul, and it's great to be on the call today. So in terms of the series of books, we kicked them off a few years ago. So the first one was Next Generation PMOs. So what we saw basically was there's an opportunity to start to just really transform the way we work. So if we start to use advanced data analytics and artificial intelligence just to make tomorrow a little bit better than yesterday, we're missing the opportunity, right? There's a huge opportunity to really start to transform the way we work. So that's what we're trying to do through the series of books. So the first one was the Next Generation PMO. So the second one was on Next Generation Risk Management, and that helped to reimagine the approach to risk management, moving towards variance analytics. So I worked with Andy on that. He very kindly edited the book with me. So I've been having conversations with Andy for some time about this assurance puzzle as well, about what we do about solving it. So I reached out to Andy. So we talked about writing a book together. Then we reached out to Michael as well. Michael had got some cracking ideas about the concept of orders that we'll come on to in a bit as well. So what we're trying to do through this series of books is to put some thought pieces out there to get people really thinking about this scale of this opportunity, because it's absolutely huge. So it's about transformational thinking, and that's what the books help to do. So it helps you to really think about the scale of the opportunity. Okay.
Excellent. Okay. Andy, can you do the same thing? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and then why assurance and why now?
Yeah, thanks, Paul, and hello, everyone. So I've been involved in projects and programs my whole career, and I was very lucky quite early on. I got involved in developing some of the best practice products that many of us will use, the likes of Prince 2 and then some other guidance for the Association for Project Management and also UK government. And I've also been a deliverer of projects, and then I spent a good amount of time, probably 15 years of my career, acting as someone that does these reviews. And so I've been heavily involved in looking at how projects are being delivered, how they're set up, and then providing that feedback to those involved. And I've always been painfully aware that when we provide our assurance reviews, it's a bit like the opening scenes on on a James Bond film, with that small ball that's sort of floating around the screen, and that's sort of our view into a project. So we don't get to see the whole project at any one point. We're seeing parts of it. And also our processes are quite manual in terms of, can you provide me with things, and I review them, then I might interview some people and so on. So I've always been fascinated with an idea of how can we have an approach where we have more of the data and more of the insights available to us on a permanent basis, to help us provide that assurance in a much more efficient but also an effective way.
Okay, thank you, Andy. I think we've probably all got different views on assurance. So could you sort of sum that up for us? And also, I think the book mentions project controls. Could you just explain a little bit of that as well too, please?
Yeah, well, the book itself is it's got six chapters in it, and chapter 2 is a sort of a review of current theory and practice, and the other books in the series follow the same format. So before setting out how we can reimagine it, we need to explain what it is. And what's really interesting when we sort of cast the net to cover what does assurance really mean, and what are the different models and frameworks and approaches to assurance, is that there isn't really a consistent view. So I've just got a few in front of me here. So APM describes it as a process of providing confidence to stakeholders that projects will achieve their objectives for beneficial change. PMI is similar, but it talks about it being an independent process to assess the health and viability of a project to ensure it meets its objectives and identify risks. The practice framework talks about it being a set of activities intended to ensure objectives and management processes are fit for purpose. So there's a link back there to sort of quality management, that fit for purpose. PeopleCert, Prince 2 distinguishes between sort of quality assurance and project assurance, and describes it also as a role and an activity. So it describes it in a range of ways. Interestingly, MSP talks about it being a discipline, and ISO 21500 talks about it being a role, and the Till book talks about it being a systematic set of activities. So if you just cast that net, and there's others as well, by the way, there's like 10 or so other frameworks that we could link back to, but each of those are describing it as both a role, a process, a set of activities, and so on. So we would perhaps, the way we're thinking about it in this book, as more of a system of those things rather than any one of those things. But at the core of all of that is a sort of recurring word that keeps coming up, and that's about confidence. So it is a system designed to give you confidence in the thing that you're doing. And in our case, this confidence will be confidence in a project or program.
Okay. Could you run us through some of the key principles in the book and the need for change as well?
Yeah, so there's sort of the book's in sort of 6 parts. The first bit being sort of an introduction to the purpose of the book and how it relates to the others in the series, and then we cover the current theory and practice, and then we move into the issues. And I think you can see it now on the screen. One of the sort of concluding findings that we came up with by looking at the evidence out there in terms of issues. So we looked at lots of reports and academic studies into the value and performance of assurance. And one of the things that we sort of synthesized it as this sort of this assurance death spiral. So we have seen an increase in assurance activities over the past 30 or so years, and this is something that I found when I was working at Transport for London, in terms of when a project arrives at a stage gate or a key milestone, and some issues are detected through either the control functions or through the independent assurance, that the lessons learned, if you like, or the how can we prevent that from happening again, is that we end up with more rules and checks. But those more rules and checks tend to then apply to all projects rather than just the one that's perhaps triggered the challenge, and that increases the effort, increases the time taken to get to either the next stage or for other projects to get to the similar stage, and in turn means that if you're not ready, it means you might find more issues, and those issues then lead to more work. So there's this sort of escalating spiral of more checks and more reviews and more checkers. And on the screen now, you can just see sort of where we've got to. This is just some of the things that can apply to a major project with a UK lens that may well be sort of publicly funded. And interestingly, the findings in the book that this has all happened since the mid-90s. So the history of project and program management, project assurance didn't appear as a combination of words once until the mid-90s, and it first appeared in Prince 2 as it happened, and then since then there's more and more sort of frameworks around the concept of project assurance or assurance in a project environment. And so they're sort of some of the findings. And then if you sort of just move it on, so some specific issues, and again we've referenced back to academic studies and other reports. We sort of highlighted them in these sort of 12 areas, and you can see sort of some of these are down to human behaviors and sort of the people factor, as we call it. So when and when not to use the override button. There was a classic case, wasn't there, with the financial crisis with ABN AMRO and that one of the Scottish banks, the takeover, where the chief exec used the override button, much to the dismay of the investors and the board, and they found that they were unable to prevent that happening. But you can see there's a whole list here, and perhaps in a moment we'll be interested to hear the views of those that have joined us as to how many of these sort of resonate or you can recognize in your own project and program environment. If you just move on, so the sort of thinking that we have come up with, in relation to those issues is, and as I sort of covered right in my introduction, is an idea that assurance, it would be great if it was always on, a bit like some of the tech we have in our cars today that are always providing that monitoring for us. It's adaptive, so that means adaptive to the context and the environment, the stage you are of the project. It's semi-automated, so that it intervenes when it needs to quickly, rather than us waiting perhaps for the next periodic review, and it's at source. So that source being that we're not getting layers of interpretation, so it's come straight from the point of assurance that we're seeking. And then to help us, how do we apply that concept of always on, adaptive, semi-automated assurance at source? We provide a framework of how we can think of the opportunities that we could apply that thinking to, and we've got these 3 innovation horizons, from one which is just getting more efficiency and more effectiveness within the current regime that we've got. Horizon 2 is we're now able to do things we couldn't do before, and Horizon 3 is saying, hang on a minute, we don't want faster horses here. Is there a completely different way of thinking about how we apply assurance with the capabilities that we now have? And then the practical steps that the book provides, if you just move it on, is a way of thinking about how we apply AI and data analytics in an assurance concept. So we've got this idea of windows. So just thinking about when a particular assurance intervention could be needed depends upon the window relating to the project. There's also different confidence thresholds as to when it would be triggered or not. There's some guardrails that you'd put in place. So it's the right thing that you would be applying. And then we think about what are those signals that we would use to help us interpret the insights and the actions that might be needed. So it's just a way of providing a bit of a design framework, if you like, about how we might apply some agents that would do some assurance on our behalf using the technology that's now available to us. If you can just move it on. And the sort of the rethinking that Horizon 3 in particular that comes in is that a lot of the issues, and I'm sure we'll get this in the chat in a moment, that we cite in the book, are actually issues of project management as well as issues of assurance. And so the conclusion we came to is that our governance structure isn't helping in some of that assurance death spiral, particularly where projects are multi-organizational, which is nearly all of them in my experience, and you've got these multiple layers. And then when we apply the concept of the 3 lines model, which many people will be familiar with in a governance and assurance concept, once you have it over those multiple layers, with each of them doing their 3 lines, you can end up with 15, 20 lines. And that's how we end up with the burdensome approach to assurance, but also a weaker approach to assurance, because everyone assumes that someone else's line is doing it. And so you can get the gaps in the assurance model. So this is the work that Michael has brought in, and it really sits really neatly with some of the ideas around the always on adaptive semi-automated assurance at source. And then lastly, rather than just say, right, here it is, go, we provide a thought framework, if you want, a playbook. So there's 7 plays that can help people apply the ideas that come from the book. And then there's a few goodies in the appendix as well, but essentially that's what we've got in the book.
Okay, great. Martin, can I bring you in as well now? And just maybe can you take us through some of the ideas for next generation methods?
So just before we jump into that, Paul, we'd like a bit of audience participation. So we've got the Menti link up there. So if people could jump into Menti. So let me get that going for you. So we've got a few questions. So Andy's going to walk us through these. So there's the Menti code. So get your phones out. So scan the QR code or go to menti.com and put in 54863315. So there you go. That's the first set of questions. So some of these questions as well, I've mixed them up a bit so they're not all loaded in terms of being to the negative. So you do have to think them all through and see if you agree or disagree with it.
Yeah, and these relate to the findings in the book in terms of the things like false confidence, for example. If you've only got that small window in and you give there's an assumption this has had some assurance, so therefore, the project's worthy to proceed. So it doesn't always necessarily flag up some of those issues. So now we've got sort of 30 odd people that have logged into Menti now. So it'd be great if you can
It's just
start dragging them across.
So let me just.
Here we go. Yeah, excellent.
Right. Let's see if I can get that back up again. I don't think I'll press the right button on it, Andy. No. Right, we'll do it in this. Let me get rid of that. That makes it a bit bigger.
Oh, the numbers are going down.
Yeah, more people are coming in. Yeah, so current assurance practice genuinely improves project outcomes. Yeah, I'm glad that's to the right of that, because although we've set out what are the current models and frameworks and practices, and then said what are the issues, we've put the issues in to be critical. It's a critical review of assurance practices. I don't think anywhere we say we should forget and do nothing. Because that would be the other extreme, wouldn't it? To revert back to perhaps how it was before we put project assurance in the first place. And it's my experience too, as someone that's spent 15 or so years doing these reviews. I've got really good examples of where we've had a finding, made a recommendation, the recommendation's been acted upon, and the project's improved as a result. Sadly, I also have some examples where we've made a finding, made a recommendation's been ignored, and the issues persisted. So, I've seen somewhere I've sort of, it's been a challenge to sort of move on, having done the review, to see it continue. But overall, I would say the interventions that I've been involved in have resulted in a positive outcome. So I'm glad that one's up there. So let's look at the other one. So the right checks at the right time seems to be our lowest one on that screen. Yeah, and I think that is often a challenge, isn't it, in terms of how do you know when the need to intervene, and is it the right intervention at that particular point in time? Assurance findings ignored or lack teeth. Yeah, so it'd be interesting when we have a bit of a discussion part as to how many people, find that the actions to respond to assurance findings sometimes are there to pacify or to satisfy the assurers or then the approvers relating to that assurance activity. I've certainly seen that, where you say, hang on a minute, this finding was X, and you've just done the bare minimum to say you can close that action. Interesting. Certainly resonates some of the findings in the book.
Right, let's move on to the next one. So this links back to the lessons learned part of the book. So we talk about lessons learned. So back in 2017-18, I pulled together 20,000 lessons learned. So that's what got me going on my journey, really, and got me going really deep on this. And I found that we weren't feeding that back into sort of practice. It lacked context. So because of that, assurance should be checking. So we're picking up these mistakes we've made in the past and making sure that the future is better than it was previously. So let's see what you think of that. There's the QR code if you want the QR code. So if you can engage with that. See if we can get the results up.
Excellent.
Go back. Yeah, I don't think I've set this up right today. I'm not quite sure why the results aren't
Well,
coming
maybe
through.
we could just get those out in open conversation then, Martin.
Yeah, okay, leave that with me and I'll try and fix that in a minute. So there's a few more questions on here. So if you could go through those questions for me, we'll come back to them when I've got it working properly. All right. So Paul, back to you. You posed the question for me before.
Yeah, exactly. I just want you to join in and give us some ideas of next generation methods.
So it's about using data and artificial intelligence to really start to transform the way we think about it. So we thought about these windows, for instance, right? So if we're going up to review, there's an opportunity when your influence becomes really significant to change the outcomes, right? So there's an assurance event where you really want to double check what's going on through that window. So if you're outside of that window, then you're probably too late to influence the outcomes. So it's things like, for instance, assumptions. So when do assumptions start to get baked in at the point that you've made your commitment? So it's very difficult to back out of those assumptions. So we've got an example as well. So we work with a major client. So one of those assumptions was that the groundworks would start in summer. So it started 5 months later because of all of the procurement treacle they've got to go through. So one of the assumptions in the contract was that if that sort of contract is not let on time and it's let later, then it's a price escalation because moving sort of earth in the winter is a lot more expensive than moving in the summer. So that was in the documentation set, but nobody knew about it. So it was on page 60 of the contract or something. So it wasn't pulled out. So just imagine we've got a system which is sniffing for all those assumptions all the time and looking at those assumptions about, so when do they get baked in? So if we could pull that out during the procurement process and say, we've got to find those assumptions, we've got to surface them and make sure we can make decisions on those assumptions when we can influence the outcomes. So if you're trying to make a decision about that when you've already placed the contract in November, it's too late. It's baked in. So that's a great example of where we can start to use technology to surface it and link it to those decision windows. So in terms of some of the other examples as well, so I think it's just always on assurance as well, right? It's just making sure we're looking at the documentation set that's in front of us, all the data and all the evidence. What can we find from that evidence which is going to flag up areas of concern? So what we tend to do with assurance, we come in periodically and we look at the project. If it's baked in, And it's not baking it in terms of checking what's going to get done. If it's baked into an agent, it's baked into the workflow. So it means that the workflow can only execute in a certain way. So you don't need to check that people are following certain processes or whatever, because it's baked into the workflow. So you can make sure the agent is then executing that workflow, and you can have an adversarial agent that comes along. It looks at that sort of first agent's output and then double checks it. So it's all baked into the workflows themselves. So you then start to question, so what do we need to do in terms of the assurance that sits over the top if it's baked in at source? And that's the general principle behind the book, really. It's always on and it's at source. So what does that mean to all the assurance activities? And if we think about project controls, so I'm doing quite a lot of work on this at the moment. What do we mean by controls? So there's two sorts of controls. The first control is setting up your project. Right? So what does the plan look like? What does the cost plan look like? What does the schedule look like, etc.? So that's working out the logic puzzle to deliver the thing you're trying to deliver. So those controls, if you're responsible for the work phase, you're responsible for working out what that sequencing is and which squad you need on site at time. Do you need a plasterer? Do you need this material? Do you need that material? If you're removed from that, so if you've got an oversight role, so we call it project controls in client organizations like HS2 and MOD, etc. Is it really project controls, or is that an assurance function? If an assurance function, if we're doing this at source and we're checking all this stuff done properly at source, then what's left? What's left for the project controls people to do? So that brings us to the second part of it. So one is setting it up, but one is responding to the emerging environment. So it's looking at the uncertainty in the system. And what we tend to do with that, we tend to do forecasting, which is quite linear processes. So we can use all of this tool set now to really start to transform what's the impact of controls on that future of the project. And that's where we bring in a different sort of assurances. What's your approach in terms of your analytical approach to being able to preempt the future? So your predictive algorithms, predictive capabilities, etc. So assurance then starts to move from process compliance is to now, so what's the training data set behind your models? How's it been calculated, whatever? That's a very different skill set as well. So Andy and Michael, do you want to sort of jump in on that? Is there anything I've missed?
Do you go first, Michael?
Okay.
Or I'm happy to.
I think you got it.
Yeah. Well, maybe one point then Andy mentioned earlier was this distinctive idea in the book about the concepts of orders. So Michael, do you think you could sort of just explain it simply and why it matters?
Certainly. I'm going to share this window, put that back on the screen for us to talk about this. So the simplest way to think about orders is they're not about the work or how the work is grouped. It's about how the stewardship and the hierarchy works. And by stewardship, I mean the responsibility of the decision-making layers, both upwards and downwards across the system. If you take something like an SRO, there may be accountable for the program, and the program is dependent on the projects, and the delivery teams below that to produce the credible evidence. And they need to surface that when it's needed. But at the same time, they also have to answer upwards to the portfolio or the enterprise layers in order to give them the confidence about what's going on with the program. So it's about understanding the relationship between how these different layers interact with each other. So when we say order, in principle, it's the level above, below the agent and the ladder of the delegated authority, and what accountability stays anchored at what level and what needs to be moved up, what are the trigger points, and so forth. So orders matter because project, program, portfolio labels tells you how the work is grouped, but it doesn't actually reliably tell you where the decision belongs or how it should move through the system. Once these things are left implicit or and then we change the assurance to expand to compensate for how we do that. We get blurred accountability, transition gaps, and a lot more checking because nobody's confident that the right decisions are being made at the right levels. So order is really a way of making those stewardship relationships explicit so that confidence can be designed rather than improvised based on unknowns.
Okay, so why, Michael? Why do you think this? Yeah, what does this change in practice? Well, no, not really. Let's come back to the why has this not happened to date so far?
So I think the main reason why this hasn't happened is because of how our management language and guidance becomes thinner as we move up through the system. So at the project level, it's more bound and defined. We heard about Prince 2 earlier. There's a lot of practical methodology. It's at source, is what we were saying before. And there's core disciplines anchored in them. When you move up to program level, complexities are much higher because you're trying to bring together multiple different projects, dependencies, readiness, benefits, guidance all together in order to deal with it. And as a result, MSP is, as an example, is a pretty thick book of how to do that. But moving above that, something really changes quite significantly. We're moving further away from the actual core delivery, but also the book gets thinner and the methodologies get thinner. So at the portfolio layer, when you should be making multiple programs and programs coming together, sequencing, risk, in practice, it's much harder to do that than even at programmatic level. And you're managing risk around many projects and programs all at the same time. It's about interactions, dependencies, overload, but the guidance is even thinner than it is before. And when you go to above portfolio level, when the relationship between the portfolio and how that works with the wider organization, it's even thinner still. So when the system becomes more complex as it moves upwards, more strategic, we have less guidance as we move along the system too, and we're getting further and further. And that's where we come back to the key word, confidence starts to erode. So the problem in practice is like we'll use risk management. Delivery risk is relatively tangible, but portfolio risk is far more cross-cutting and systematic. Then organizational risk becomes kind of focused on the top down without linking that clearly to the evidence below that supports it. So practice, we don't scale upward, even though the complexity does. So the result is senior people like to go down into the weeds and get the long screwdriver or various other different expressions to, get their assurance because they don't have the confidence and they want to see something tangible that they can work and relate with.
So where should people start to apply this thinking then, Michael?
What needs to change in practice is that assurance needs to stop being something that mainly happens at project intervals. It starts becoming something that moves through the work. Instead of teams spending weeks assembling packs and periodic reviews, evidence needs to be generated through normal delivery, as we said, through AI and through always being on in a more usable form. Confidence is built closer to the source, and assurance becomes more targeted. When signals weakened, you don't wait for the next board, but that should be automatically escalated upwards. You respond when something meaningful happens and you can see exactly where it's coming from. Gateway reviews still matter because they come, shorter and more focused on very specific activities. But what we're talking about is the overarching governance and assurance that is happening through the system. Boards need to spend less time checking everybody's homework and more focusing on the individual issues as they escalate upwards and are aggregated upwards. So where people should start, it's not a grand transformation. It's not building a new assurance layer or building a new kind of methodology. It starts by releasing capacity, stripping out some of the assurance theater, and it's treating more work at the top that's already overloaded, but giving them the necessary structures in place in order to be able to filter down the boundaries that they need downwards. So it's about picking one of these slices and building that relationship above and below in an effective way to build that decision-making layering, and testing that through governance, measuring whether it produces earlier confidence or less burden than it did before.
Excellent, excellent, thank you. Martin, do you want to go back to the Menti questions? I think, see if we can get that to work. And just while we're doing that, we've got a lot of people are agreeing, a lot of people are making some comments, but we're not getting many questions coming through. So if you want to ask any particular questions, please do put them in the chat or in the Q&A.
So I thought I got all this working. I put it into survey mode up here, so it should be working now. So see if you can get into that. So Andy, could we come back to this point here? Right, it's this point at the bottom. So assurance provides the right checks at the right time. Right, so do people strongly agree or strongly disagree? There's a big lump in the middle. Right. So what's your view on that?
Well, one of the things that we pull out in the book is the value of integrated assurance and approval plans. The lesser spotted integrated assurance and approval plans I might add, and they should help you do exactly that, which is what are the critical decisions that need to be made, and who's authorized to make those decisions, and what confidence will they seek in order to make those decisions. Bringing that confidence word in, we can look to assurance to help with that confidence, and when you think about that, then sort of what reviews and independent checks are would be helpful to help those decision makers make those decisions with confidence. So I think the right checks at the right time really should originate from that integrated assurance and approval plan. So the good practice of having those things doesn't go away. One of the things that we can do, which is related to the lessons learned question from before, which is over time, when we start to identify patterns from different types of projects with different contexts, it can help inform what sort of checks are needed to help those decision makers at the right time. So that's the adaptive part of our always on adaptive assurance, automated assurance at source.
Good. So in terms of this one as well, so lessons learned. So back to this piece of work I did. So I looked at Australia and New Zealand as well about what they'd done on their lessons learned. So government used to publish these reports, and I think it was every 6 months or something like that. So they published these reports on themes of governance and benefits management and project management, etc. So they stopped publishing them after about 4 years. So I went back through all of them, and they're basically saying you've got to follow the instruction set, right? Follow the manual. And people weren't following the manual because they were pressing the override button, they were shortcutting, they were not following that due process. So they stopped publishing those documents because it was saying the same thing. Just follow the rules, right? Follow the rules, follow the rules, follow the rules.
Do what the book says.
Yeah, do what the book says, basically. Do what you're paid to do, follow the manual. So for me, that's not lessons learned. That's more about process compliance. So lessons learned should be things like, what's the optimized workflow, right? What's the optimized schedule? So if you applied some value engineering that saved a few, millions of pounds, then we should do that again. But that's not captured in these lessons learned. So the lessons learned said, things like do stakeholder engagement better, right? So we should have had more resources on the project, but it didn't sort of quantify it. So it relies on context. So with assurance, we've really got to think about what we're trying to do through assuring that we're not going to make the same mistakes of the past and we're optimizing. I think that's really important. I think it's lost in a lot of the assurance methodologies at the moment, but we can use advanced data analytics and artificial intelligence to really go at this hard, because every time we've got an assurance event, right, where something diverges from plan, if we capture that in the data set, when we see that again, so similar context again, it's going to flag up to us that this is the optimized process to go and do it, and these are the things to be alert to. So it's always on assurance again, right? It's really cool. So let's go to the next one. So this is where I've said there's 100 points to go and do something. So to spread across all of these different questions. So there's 37 of those points, right? So on average, this is 37 of the points. So people think it's mainly a compliance exercise. And a lot less people think that it's a genuine performance improvement tool. Now that's where we should be, right? It's got to move the dial on project delivery, because there's things that's getting through which shouldn't be getting through. And if we can become alert to them and start to affect that change. So I've worked on some major projects and I've had sort of assurance people come to me. You've got to get through that assurance process. It's a badge that you need to wear. You need to get through it. And when they've gone, you can go and sort of crack on with your job. That's not what it should be about. We should have these target teams coming in who's going to help you sort of navigate some of these sort of challenges and surface them much, much earlier. So if we can surface them earlier, we can put the fires out when they're little embers, not when they're towering infernos. That's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, it's interesting, Martin, that performance improvement tool. If we wanted to reverse our assurance death spiral, you may recall seeing the image from earlier. Confidence was at the center of that spiral. So if we wanted to reverse that spiral, so it's an assurance confidence spiral, then performance improvement is the way to do it. The more we demonstrate the ability to deliver by improving performance, the fewer checks and balances that we'll need, and so it will be a self-improving loop rather than an escalating loop that we've currently got.
Yeah. So finally, as well, is learning mechanism that's popped up on the bottom. That's really important. It's got to be something where we're picking stuff up and it's getting better and better. Back to your point, Andy. Final point on Mentimeter as well. So if you could all fill this in as well, is what is the one thing you'd like to see change? And we can build on this, right? So we will update the book at some point. So we'd like to follow this up as well. So we're going to do a webinar probably in May, where we'll do a deeper dive into the book. So we'll really get under the hood of some of these themes, etc. So if there's anything in there that you'd like to see, we can pull that into the next webinar, which will be in May.
As we're talking about questions, I've got a couple of questions from the attendees. Are you happy for me to answer those now?
Yep.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So first one from Carl. Should assurance effort and activity change through the project lifecycle? How so?
Definitely. So one of the things that we look at in the book actually goes back to the origins of quality assurance and quality management. A chap called Phil Crosby, who also introduced us. The world of maturity models comes from Phil Crosby's work. But he talked about the cost of quality being something you can optimize, and that's the cost of things going wrong, offset by the cost of detecting things going wrong. So in an ideal world, you'd actually have no assurance. The cost of assurance would be zero, and there'll be no errors in what you're producing. So therefore, there's no consequence of doing no assurance. But that's not what happens. So there's a balance, isn't there, between how much do you want to do and the value it brings. And so thinking in terms of the reviews, therefore, that you need through the life cycle, that then relates to the consequences of the decisions that you're making. So early on, you tend to have a little bit more assurance around those key critical investment decisions, because they're locking in the routes and options that you've got afterwards. Whereas perhaps once you're in delivery, the nature of assurance will be different. So it definitely needs to adapt over the life cycle, and linking it back to that integrated assurance and approval plan. It really helps. And one of the things that we're putting out there, and again, it's not prescriptive in terms of this is how it's done. The book is there to generate conversations and ideas about how can we apply this sort of really powerful capabilities that we now have that are being applied in other domains, but not in our domain, to how we can use it.
Okay. Thank you. I'll go on. We've got a few more. So another question is around the technical assurance and information management are two separate disciplines. How do we get these two intertwined disciplines to use the same language?
So that's another one for Andy, I think.
Yeah, I wish I knew the answer to that. As I covered earlier, our trawl through, the frameworks that are out there, there's, the more we looked at, the more definitions of project assurance we came across. Okay, they're all similar, but they weren't the same. And then when you go outside of a particular discipline, you end up with, different terms meaning different things. I'm hopeful that in the way that we can use large language models for translation, that we are going to get translation of different concepts and terms from different management disciplines too. So it's easier for us to work with others.
Okay, thank you. Another one, and maybe something some clarity required. So when you talked about assurance being baked in to workflows, can you be clear on exactly what you mean by that?
I can take that, and a little bit about the previous question as well. There's an element here of we don't have a common definition, for example, for something like risk. So we have a portfolio, and in that portfolio is a couple programs, and in a couple programs there's projects. So there's an element of, does the program effectively get the risk data as it's moving through an effective apples to apples kind of way? This is where some of the IT and some of the assurance languages comes through. Have those risks effectively been categorized in a common data way? And from one program to the next program, have those risks been categorized in an effective way so that the program teams can look at that risk data as it's coming through and effectively bring them up strategically to programmatic level risk, and from that up into portfolio level risk. And there's an element here of the assurance language, being able to see the project, how that transformed into program, how that transformed into portfolio, needs common definitions, common ways of working, and will provide the necessary evidence of why are we saying at a portfolio level things are red in recruitment, because we can actually dive down deep into the data and be able to pull that up all the way through. So it's a little bit answering the previous question as well as this one, is the assurance comes through, the confidence in the data comes through when there's a common methodology of how all that information comes through in a very systemic way.
So it's bigger than that as well, I think. So if we think about the problem that we've just described, we can solve some of that through data dictionaries, data taxonomies, etc. Right? But we lose the context. It's the context that is really important. So if you don't have the context, we can't get these algorithms really performing. So we need context. So that's something called meaning, right? Semantic graphs and things like that. So we need a knowledge graph through an ontology where we help to solve that. And that's what we're doing through the concept of Project Brain that we've been working on for a little while. We've been doing that with the coalition. So we're looking at risk, for instance, and saying, what do we actually mean by risk? What do we mean by systemic risk? So people think systemic risk is the stuff that affects lots of projects, right? So it's the organizational risk that applies to lots and lots of projects. Might be resourcing, for instance. But if you look at the definition of systemic, it's also something that's going to infect a load of projects at pace. So COVID, for instance, impacted a lot of projects really, really fast and had an exponential impact on them, right? So it's the stuff that starts to take over. So those are the things that can really catch you out because they multiply and they morph very, very quickly. So we haven't, with some of these processes, what we're trying to assure is process adherence. We've lost sight of what we're trying to do. And that's what the ontology does, because it takes us back to the meaning of what we're trying to do. And with risk management, for instance, right, what you're trying to assure is, so you're trying to minimize the downside and maximize the upside based around the context, right? If you're assuring that process, it's very different to assuring the process of risk management, which is, have you filled in your risk register and when's the last time you update it, and are people following through the management actions, right? That's the theatre part of it. It's not necessarily going to move the dial. So we need an ontology so we can work out what data we need so we can really get artificial intelligence working for us. And it's very difficult to do that in project delivery because it's not like working for Marks and Spencer's where everything's in a SCOS code. So I know what your sort of address is, I know what your credit card number is, etc. It's all nicely organized data. Ours is a bag of bits from project to project. There's no commonality really. And solving that through a taxonomy is not the right approach because everyone's taxonomy is going to be different, right? Even inside of Shell, which is an international business, they use different words for different things, mean for the same thing, right? So we can't solve it by forcing people into this. But what artificial intelligence does, it becomes the Babel fish on some of that. So we don't need to force people into common standards in terms of definitions.
Thank you. Okay, we'll just take
Paul, can I just come in real quick on that assurance
sorry.
of source? So some examples. So one of the things that we've done through the book is look outside of project management. And so, it's sort of covered in the introduction that, the world of projects is relatively slow to adopt data analytics and AI compared to other disciplines and domains. And so we looked at things like automotive and aviation and medicine, pharmaceuticals, and so on. So one of the things that we put in those innovation horizons are some examples from other domains and have applied them thought about them in a project context. So in terms of that at source, most people here will probably have a car with lane departure warning system on it. That's a form of assurance at source. It's independent of the driver. And if you try to change a lane without signaling, it will give your steering wheel a little wobble. That's the alert that you get. The human in the loop still makes a decision: do they carry on changing lane or do they revert back into their lane? And the feedback loop you get is that it encourages you to signal before you change lanes, which is brilliant because it's that improvement bit that we were talking about earlier, that lower ranking thing. So if we're all better at signaling before we change lane, we don't get the steering wheel wobble, and actually people around us are getting a prior warning that we're about to to change lane. So what's the equivalent in project context of that lane departure warning? So it's real time. It still alerts the human. It's the human in the loop decides what to do about it, and it's not the periodic review, I would argue, and it's something that we make the case for in the book too.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. And if we get some time, we'll come back. But we've got sort of 8 minutes just to start to get towards the end. So Andy, or team, you've really explained and started to make sense of this whole journey. But what do you see, Andy, perhaps as the biggest barriers that we need to navigate?
Our lack of imagination, I think, is the biggest barrier, and that curiosity to look outside of our current practice and see what's happening elsewhere, and applying it to how we do it. And then the other barrier is because of the nature of projects being temporary and cutting across organizations and so on, and with long cycle times often, which means the feedback loops aren't as short as, say, in other management domains. We still have a lot of sort of myths and legends in influencing how we do some of our projects. And a really good example of that is the iron triangle, which was put together in terms of that time, cost, and quality, explaining that there's a trade-off that you may need to make when you're scoping a project where you're setting it up. It's not intended to be used as a form of control, yet it is. And you could actually log on and register for a training course, and you might still hear it being described as a form of control. It was never intended for that. And there's been some great research that showed that when it's used as a form of control, like our assurance data spiral, it can actually escalate a project to go out of control. Yet it's still being taught. I still come across it time and time again. So in terms of what are the barriers, one is our lack of imagination. The other one is our lack of evidence for how we apply practices. And if we did that, we would hopefully remove some of those myths and legends that aren't quite right.
So I think of one of skills as well. So with skills, if people they don't understand the art of the possible. They don't understand what you can do. They don't understand about ontologies and data structures. We'll never unlock this future because they can only see what's in front of them. So if they're looked in, so back to this ambition thing, if you start to educate people about the art of the possible, which is why we do these sort of events and write the books, etc., but we need people with the skills who's going to develop the solutions so we can start to drive this. And in terms of developing those skills, we've got a hackathon coming up. So that's in, it's about a month's time. So it's at Rolls-Royce. So some of the challenges which we tackled previously have been assurance related challenges. So one of them, so the red team agent challenge. So do you want to just summarize that one, Andy?
Yeah, so that was again just through these sort of thought experiments that we sort of included in the book, thinking about that assurance at source. So if we think about it from a tendering perspective, so from the perspective of a buyer, a procurer, would it be great if they could help the bidders be more compliant with the tender response requirements, and also be more effective in terms of what they're seeking to procure? So actually helping them produce the best possible response. And so one of the things that we put together for this is rather than each of the bidders having some form of large language model, GPT helping them, with their tender response, the buyer would actually issue effectively a chatbot with the tender pack so that the prospective bidders could test their responses before they submitted it. So the quality coming into the buyer has now improved because the algorithm that's being used to help test the draft submissions has been developed by them. And this particular hack, the way that we did it, we just focused on one aspect of a bid, which was social value. We interviewed a number of social value specialists from client side that review and rate tender submissions, and we asked them questions like, what is a great response, what are your pet peeves, what do people often get wrong, and those transcripts were made available to the hack teams, who then used it to train a bot to guide the prospective bidders on their submissions. And I think, what was it, in a day and a half, there was a viable prototype developed by the team that worked on that challenge.
It might just be worthwhile, just before you move on to that slide, the hack that was on the screen there is hack 27. So that's upcoming. That will be happening on the 22nd, the 23rd of April at Rolls-Royce in Derby. So Erin's just put a link. If you are interested and you want to take part, then please do. You can register through the link or through the QR code you can see there, or through the link that's in the chat now. So I just thought it was just worth mentioning that.
So in terms of books as well, so there's the download for the book. It's all available free of charge. It's the way we roll, so we give these things away because we think it's very important to get the ideas out there, right? Because these ideas could make a massive difference for society. So if we can start to work together, and that's what we try and do through the apprenticeships as well. So through the apprenticeships, if we can work together through the concept of a product group, then we can create the solutions to unlock these ideas in the book. And instead of each organization trying to solve those problems independently, just imagine we all work together and start to drive this at pace. It becomes transformational. And if we do that for risk management, we do it for PMOs, we do it for everything, we will collectively transform the future of project delivery as a free byproduct of a free course. How cool is that? All right? That's what we should be doing. So if you want to get involved in these courses, you want to know about them, and you want to get your teams involved, it's not just about a training course, it's about co-creating this future that we've just been describing. That's what we can do. It's about inspiring people. It's about giving the ambition and the skills to go and do it.
Excellent. Thank you, Martin. I think we're just about out of time, so I'd just like to thank everybody for participating. obviously, if there's any more information you want to have from us, then please use the inquiries there, the email, again, the QR code, or reach out to any of the panel, myself, via LinkedIn. But yeah, just thank everybody. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Andy and Michael, for an extremely interesting insight into the next generation of project assurance. And I think that's it. I think that's on the hour. So thank you very much for joining, and really interesting. Thank you, guys.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you all for coming.